about the STEM lecture series. It is the fourth Tuesday in this auditorium at 11:10 and 5 o'clock, the months of October, November, February, March, and April, and the talks are all about science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. To whet your appetite, here's the lineup for this academic year. In November, right before Thanksgiving, think about that, fat, not just a villain, but could aid our health. So fat is not just a bad thing, but could be a good thing, and right before Thanksgiving dinner. And that's the fourth Tuesday of November. In February, what's new in microbiology. In March, exploring a metabolic aspect of the parasite that causes African sleeping sickness. And in April, which is Ecology Month, environmental activism today, how to protect our environment. So that's the lineup for this academic year. So I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers, but first give special thanks to Dr. Eric Wellington, our provost, whose funding through the Experiential Learning Committee made the project possible and made this STEM lecture possible. The title of today's talk is Unraveling the Tapestry of Your DNA. What are your origins? And our speakers are Tyler Daniels, part-time instructor of communication studies at DCCC, Dr. Anita Foman, professor of communication studies at Westchester University, Alyssa Massarella, a communication studies major at DCCC, Alyssa, Dr. Jerry Parker, Delaware County Community College president, and Dr. Bob Saran, assistant professor of biology at DCCC. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our panel discussion.
Try and use the mic. Is that okay? Everyone hear me in the back? Excellent. So I'm Dr. Bob Saran, and I'm going to start out just talking a little bit about what DNA is. And here we go. I like to think about DNA as a collection of valuable cookbooks. So every cell has DNA. They store its genetic information in that DNA. And so you can think of DNA as a collection of cookbooks that is passed down from generation to generation. Okay? And so if you cook like I do, if you have a very valuable cookbook, and you can never take that in the kitchen. I'm a little all over the place when I cook. And the cell is the same way. So it has this very valuable collection of cookbooks, but it never uses them directly to make anything. What the cell does is it copies the information from the cookbook into molecules of RNA. And it doesn't copy all of the information that's encoded in the DNA. It only copies a little section, just the recipe it needs. And then the cell will use that information to make protein. And a protein in a cell is the molecule that does something. Okay? So it's going to do normal cellular functions. It'll break down molecules. It'll build molecules up. But we also see that proteins then are responsible for functions we see in organisms like us, appearances, so things like hair color, eye color, things like that. It's the interaction of proteins. Okay? And so we refer to a recipe for a protein as a gene. So a gene is the segment of DNA that has the information the cell needs to make a protein. And so if we look at all of the DNA of a human, humans have 23 pairs of molecules of DNA. And if we zoom in on these, we see that those sort of X-shaped molecules we saw before, if we zoom in really closely, we see that DNA has the double helical structure you may be familiar with. And that small double helical structure is wrapped up really tightly to make these large chromosome molecules. If we look really closely, we see that DNA is made up of molecules called nucleotides. a nucleotide is made up of a phosphate, which is here indicated by that P, yep, right there, that's attached to a sugar, which is then attached to a base that's hanging off the side. Nucleotides are linked together by bonds between sugars and phosphates into really long chains. You'll notice the bases are hanging off of the side of the molecule of DNA. So this strand of DNA then can interact with another strand of DNA through interactions between the bases. And that is what gives us that double helical molecule that we just saw previously. There are 4 different bases found in DNA. Adenine, which is abbreviated A, thymine, which is abbreviated T, guanine, which is abbreviated G, and cytosine, which is abbreviated C. Adenine and thymine can interact with each other, and guanine and cytosine can interact with each other. And this pairing is specific. So if we look here just for adenine and thymine, for example, we see that the positive and negative charges on adenine and thymine line up. They can interact with each other. But the positive and negative charges between adenine and cytosine, or adenine and guanine, don't line up. So they don't pair with each other. And so when we look at a sequence of DNA, we're looking at the sequence of these bases in the chain. And so when we look at a human cell, any human cell, all of your cells have all of your DNA. Okay? But we have a bunch of different types of cells that look differently. So here, example, are some muscle cells and a nerve cell. The thing that makes cells different from each other are the genes that are made inside the cell. So if we look at the muscle cell, it's making gene 1 and gene 3 into protein 1 and protein 3. If we look at the nerve cell, it's making gene 2 and gene 3 into protein 2 and protein 3. And so this interaction of different genes causes our cells to be different. Where is DNA in a cell? So the vast majority of DNA lies in the nucleus. Okay, so we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, ends up being around 3 billion base pairs of DNA. So that's a lot of information. If you took all of the DNA in a single human cell, lined it end to end, it would be about 6 feet long. Okay, luckily, DNA is really skinny, so you can wrap it up, the cell can compact it very tightly. There's also another place that we find DNA in the cell, the mitochondria. The mitochondria have very small amounts of DNA. They have about 16,000 base pairs, which is about 1 million times less than the amount of DNA in the nucleus. Where do you get your DNA from? Well, you get your DNA from your parents. So you get one of each of your 23 pairs of chromosomes from your mother, and the other pair of each of your 23 pairs of chromosomes from your father. You also, if you're a male, have a Y chromosome. You can only get that from your father. Mitochondrial DNA is only passed from mothers to all of their children. So mothers give both their daughters and their sons all of their mitochondrial DNA. Interestingly, most of the DNA in a cell is are not genes, do not code for proteins. Only about 1 to 2% of the DNA in the cell is codes for genes. The other 98 to 99% doesn't really have much of a function. It's junk that we've accumulated, I think it's stuff that you've accumulated over generations, over time. And so kind of the practical upshot of this is we can compare DNA between different people without looking at DNA that actually affects the health or any sort of attributes of people. Okay, so we just look at that non-coding sequence. What sort of differences do we see in DNA? We see 2 main types of differences in DNA. We see base substitutions, where one base is swapped for a different base. But we also see insertions and deletions, where whole nucleotides are added or subtracted from DNA sequences. And lastly, kind of related to this talk, is how do we use DNA to understand the movement of populations? So here I have 4 hypothetical populations of people. And if we compare their DNA, we see that this bottom population has 1 sequence. The middle population has 1 change from the bottom population. It has that red G. The top 2 populations maintain that red G and then have additional changes. And so if we were to look at and try and hypothesize how these populations move, we could say that the middle population is descended from the bottom population, members of that bottom population, because we have one change there, and then those top two populations must be descended from the middle population, because they maintain that G change, but then have additional changes of their own. And that is the end of my piece.
My name is Anita Foman, and I'm going to talk about the work that I do that picks up on the mapping of the human genome. And I want to say I own more than one dress, even though I'm the same dress as in that picture. What I want to talk about is our project, where what we do is ask people to, we use what we know about the human genome to look at how we talk about race. And the project that we do is actually pretty straightforward. What we do is we ask people to talk about their racial narrative. I'm sure everybody in here has a story in their family about how their family got to the United States, and people can often say, I'm half this, I'm half Irish, I'm half French, I'm that, and a very specific story. And then what we do is we do an Ancestry DNA test. And I know there's some people in here who have participated in Professor Gardner's class. Anybody who has participated? And some of you got your results back just this morning. So we then do that, and then we ask, what's the relationship between these two stories? Does this story match up with what your family has said? And sometimes it matches up perfectly, and sometimes not, which gets us into a whole discussion of why that might be occurring. What's the difference between those two stories? Let me give you a little bit of perspective on race before I move any farther. We talk about race a lot, and what we look at when we identify race is usually what we can see, somebody's hair, their skin color, their eyes, or something on a very superficial level. First of all, we are 99.9% just exactly the same. And indeed, much of what is different in that last little bit is not associated with race, and what's more, what is racial tends to be the most superficial part of us. And still, it's fascinating to take a look at. Our groups are complex, and the research on DNA continues, and we're finding out it's even more complex than we thought all the time. People aren't in silos, so we talk about people as Asian or African or European, and it's never quite that simple. And I don't want to get into some of the newest research, but it supports that very much. And the group associations are not linear, and we continue to change and evolve in our racial makeup. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this map before of the human trek out of Africa across the globe. And again, they're finding out there's things they didn't know. For example, that Eurasians went back into Africa, and so there's more of a mix throughout Africa of European and Asian DNA than people had ever thought. So that continues. So I'm going to talk about, moving through this quickly because I'm going to show you some images and spend most of my time there. There are two stories that we have that we're talking about. One is the DNA, which we heard about so nicely just now, and the other is narrative, which is what I focus on. And these are two stories, and each of those stories has a different agenda. So your DNA only has the agenda of survival. And in fact, if you're here today, you win. We spend a lot of time talking about who's better than whom or whatever. If you're here, you won. And against all odds, there's no chance statistically that you're going to be here. And the narrative is for cultural survival. And so your family tells a narrative that's nice and neat, that tries to make your family understandable and, make you feel good about yourself, and you have heroes and villains and all of that. And so these two things have different rules, and sometimes these narratives are intended to hide as much as they reveal. Anybody think they might have some secrets in their family? Some people they don't talk about, whatever. It's just fascinating. And again, I don't have enough time to really get into it. But a narrative has a different kind of proof than DNA, that it could have happened and that it resonates. So you can have a story that could have happened, but it doesn't resonate, people won't believe it, but there are all kinds of things that could be in your background. So now we are going to interject new DNA information and see what we see. People contest race all the time, and you may be familiar with some of the stories. I don't know if you know Rachel Dolezal, who got in trouble for saying she was black when she was not. And this woman, Lindsay Schwartz, who was adopted into a Jewish family and did not know that her ancestry was African American until she was an adult. Raven Simone, who says she doesn't identify as black. And Tiger Woods, who says, what is he, Caucasian or whatever, from all of his backgrounds. So let's take a look at some of the things that we have found in our DNA, and I'll move through this pretty quickly. Here are some people who identified starting out as Asian. Now this is a gentleman who's from the Philippines. He was completely shocked when his background came back as Hispanic in this way. But if you know much about the ancestry, the history of the Philippines, it's not that surprising. But he said, you know, we're going to have some conversations in our family. Here's somebody who identifies as Indian. Both of her parents are from India. She was really funny. She said she picked up the phone and said, hey mom, dad, we're white. But this is not an uncommon profile for somebody who's of Indian ancestry, and I'm going to show you another picture later. You know, here's something interesting. She's Vietnamese, and so it came up, not surprisingly, as East Asian, and she was shocked by the Native American, but many times you cannot distinguish Asian ancestry or DNA profiles from Native Americans because of the Native Americans passing, you know, over the into the United States. I just drew a blank on that. Through the Bering Strait, and so as a result, sometimes you get that overlap, even though that's not how she identifies. Now here his background is Indian, so he again was sort of surprised by how much European there was in his background, but again, not surprising for his background. So all those people identified as Asian. Now here's some people who identify as black or African American. He was very surprised to see the Middle Eastern in his background, but of course a number of African Americans would have that in their background, and it's not surprising. In the United States, people often, especially in the past, when you look at old census forms, were identified as black or white or Native American. And you could be other things, but you just got pushed into those categories. And this is a great example of that. Here's a young woman who identifies as African American, and she said she thought she had she thought she had Indian ancestors. Well, after digging into this, we think that they were Indian from India, not Native American, and this was actually quite similar to the profile of many people from India, part of her background. Again, here's somebody African American who had some, you know, unknown background, but in our research, we didn't find anybody who, we talked about who overestimated or underestimated. There wasn't anybody who overestimated their Latino background, and we think it's because as people become part of, quote, mainstream American culture, they stop identifying in that way, especially since Latino is not really, quote, a race, it's a culture. And so once people don't identify with the culture, they stop identifying with the race, okay? Here's somebody identifies as African American. Look how much European is in his background. And similarly, you're going to see somebody who's white who has almost as much African as he does. Look at this young woman. Would you have guessed that? She put her profile up on Facebook, and people started to berate her. And they said, who do you think you are? And she was like, this is my DNA profile. So it was really interesting what feelings we have about it. And again, here's somebody looking at her. Would you have guessed that that would be her profile, though she's mixed race background? Here are some people who identify as Latino. She had mostly, but you can see there were other things. And Latino, of course, as I said, is often a mix of things. And again, here's somebody identifies as Latino, Middle Eastern in there, European, the color code is not right there. But, and I had to laugh. Here's my colleague who is very involved in Latino issues, bilingual. I said, no more multicultural scholarships for you. So, you know, and here's some folks who identify as white. Again, and what she discovered in looking at this is many people in her family were Middle Eastern. And so they had started to identify as white, even though genetically that was what her background looked like. This woman was funny. She identified as white. She's from Colombia. And the thing that shocked her most in this profile was a Native American. Now, of course, being from Colombia, it's not surprising she had indigenous Native American. But she said in Colombia there's tremendous prejudice against the indigenous people. Right. So if that's part of your background, it's a secret. So, until somebody DNA tests you, okay? Anybody here Italian background? Italians definitely got around. She was funny. She called her mother after she got her profile. Her mother said, "That's not right, and you're not ours." Both of those things are true at the same time. But we actually find many times Italians have complicated backgrounds genetically because of the history of Italy and some of the things that happened there. And it's fascinating. This stuff sends you back to the history books, back to the maps, every place, back, to medical records, all kinds of things. And here's somebody who people often identify, don't think that she's European, but that's how her background came up. So you can't always look at somebody. And this happened a lot. Let me actually go to the next one. This is cute. This guy, many people would say they have Native American background. So he said, he's giving me the story about the Native Americans. So we test him, and this comes up. God bless him. He went back to his family, and they said, maybe she was part black. So they thought it was sort of more exotic to have a Native American in their family, which is interesting. If all the people who said they have Native American in their background did, the Native American experience would be way different than it has been in this country. Here's a European, and she did believe she had Native American in her background. And again, a lot of this was like North African, Middle Eastern, but that's not how they identified over time. And this guy was like, whoa, just a little bit of everything in his background. Who would guess it? Who would have guessed that? And here again, and I don't know if her background, I found a couple of people who actually looked like her, who had a lot more African in their background, and again, it's sort of North African. And I love this one. This man is a Holocaust survivor. And we tested him, and he's Eastern European. It's not surprising, he had some Asian in his background. And God bless him, he said, maybe this is the end of race. I thought, if a Holocaust survivor can make that statement, there's hope for us all. I don't know how we change the human heart, but the fact that he remained so optimistic was shocking. And just finally, some people who identify as multicultural, who had a number of things, and this is sort of a neat, fun story to end with, that brings together narrative and genetics. This is a young man whose mom is Korean and his dad is Irish, and it came up pretty much exactly as he thought. As I said, a couple other people jumped in the gene pool, and he said when older Korean women look at him, he said he can see them looking at him like they sort of recognize something, but they're not sure. And he said to me, "Dr. Foman, my Korean is tight. I speak great Korean." And he said the second he starts speaking Korean, they say, "I want you to meet my granddaughter." And I said, for him, that's what makes a person truly authentic as a Korean. So the relationship between narrative and culture and genetics is complicated, but has been so fascinating to study, and it's always a pleasure to share it with people. So I appreciate your letting me do that.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are a lot more complicated than we realize. I mean, we are all totally unique, and there's just a lot more to it. So, hello everybody. My name is Tyler Daniels. I'm an adjunct instructor of communication studies here at Delaware County, and Newman, and Cheney. I'm all over the place. I'm just trying to spread the word of communication studies. So, I've been involved with this project for the past 4 years. I first volunteered for it back when I was a grad student at Westchester University. I thought this project was like one of the coolest things I'd ever been part of. I still think that even today, and I'm so excited that finally we were able to bring the project here, because literally every class I mention this project, even in passing, everyone's, they can't spit in a tube fast enough, quite honestly. They all want to know. I mean, seriously, and I had to keep reminding them, no, it's presentation, okay? You got to spit into a tube, you can't do it here, all right? So, culture and communication. So, as Dr. Saran and Dr. Bowman have told us, genetics clearly do matter. They do make a difference, all right? Okay, genetics are important. They influence what we look like, they can influence family narrative, they influence what we're taught, influence what we're expected to be. You often hear of people winning the genetic lottery, ka-ching. Absolutely. So, but there are some distinctly psychological and communicative factors at work as well. That's where I come in. Now, genetics, that affects purely the physical. Okay, what other people see us as. We're talking about mitochondrial DNA, what we get from the X chromosome, the Y chromosome, but what about how we act? That's where culture comes into play. Here's the deal. We are born as blank slates. Genetics influence what we look like, but not how we act. How we act, that is purely a socially constructed phenomenon through which we partially develop our identities. See, here's the deal. It is impossible to have no culture. It's impossible. If you're born and you're raised, you have a culture. You have to, go with that. All right, absolutely. And so we are taught how to communicate, how to interact, how to exist, basically, based purely on the cultural and social overtones of whatever society we are born into. As an example, baseball. All right, baseball has long been considered the national pastime of the American culture. So, ever since I was a small child, in my family, the first Phillies game was considered a rite of passage. Seriously, when you got to a certain age, you have to go to a baseball game. I didn't understand it, I didn't get it. I was just there because I was expected to attend, and I was expected to enjoy it. Because, yeah, exactly, because and it's me, for those who know me. Okay, so me at a baseball game, really. All right. For our birthdays, how we're expected to celebrate coming of age, how we're supposed to act. We're also, and the reason why this is so interesting is because in American culture, as we've pointed out, our ancestors come from all over the place. So the American culture has often been considered a melting pot. All right, so we're taking cultural values and expectations from literally all over the planet and kind of mixing and mingling them here. All right, we are taught how to act, how to live, based purely on the influence that we have based on our society and the society that we're born into. All right? Now, culture is absolutely self-sustaining, but it is always changing. All right? You will find, I mentioned this in my class many times, that the way our culture unfolds and acts now is certainly not the same as it did 50 years ago. It will certainly not be the same as it will be 50 years from now. All right? Culture is always changing based on so many social and political factors, what happens, any key events, any key waves of migration that's going to make a difference as well, all right? And very often, when we examine the present, I think we instinctively look to the past. As we use the present as a baseline for examining how far we've come and possibly trying to predict the future as well. All right, as an example, stories about our heritage. I mean, what Dr. Fohman was saying about family narratives, stories that are passed down, and how sometimes our genetic results don't quite sync up with what we've been taught. Okay, that absolutely can happen. Now, we can learn more about our ancestors, what cultures we come from, or what cultures we think we come from, and factor that into the creation of our identities. Now, personally, family history has always been a very big thing in my family. Okay, my grandmother, she's the self-proclaimed historian of the family. She assembled a binder, no kidding, a binder as thick as about 2 phone books stacked on top of one another. Everything about our family, our ancestors, where we came from, what kind of jobs we worked, how we got to this country. And stories like that can bring cohesiveness. They can bring unity to a family. Now, these people on the right here, those are actually my paternal grandparents, my father's parents. Now, unfortunately, he lost them when he was still very young, before I was even born. And so that's an entire side of the family that for many years was sort of a mystery to me. I didn't know what kinds of people they were. I didn't know the kinds of jobs they had. I didn't know how they lived their lives. I didn't know how they came to the United States. And in preparation for this project, I was pressing my dad for all the information I could get out of him. And you find out some things, you dig deep enough in any closet, sooner or later you will find a skeleton or two. That's all I have to say, okay? Because he told me in complete earnesty that we actually come from some ancestors. Some of them served in the Imperial German Army during World War I, actually fought against the United States, and after the war fled to the United States to escape prosecution for war crimes. Now, just because that's not the most uplifting story you could tell, doesn't mean it's any less important. When you're tracking family history, examining culture, you have to take every story that comes your way. Because really, there is nothing that you should ever ignore, because that certainly helped me learn more about the kinds of people that they were, why they came here, how our descendants have changed from what we came from. And so all stories are important to me, every one of them. On my other side of the family, now this is a line of my direct ancestors. Great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-great, respectively. All right, now my grandmother, she's also a bit of a storyteller. So my great-grandfather, that was the first one of our ancestors born in this country. Now, he was born into a very, kind of poor subdivision of Chicago. He worked a lot of blue-collar jobs growing up. He, tried to open a couple of restaurants. In his later life, he worked as a garbage man, believe it or not. Now, his father, my great-great-grandfather, he worked pretty much his entire life as a street sweeper. a street sweeper for the city of Chicago. And it's not one of those fancy high-tech vehicles you could presumably take for a joyride in a video game that escapes my knowledge. No, no, no. This was an old-fashioned hand-cranked machine that he drove pretty much every day of his professional career. Now his father, from Italy, okay, from what I understand, he bought and sold real estate most of his life, basically acted as a landlord. And just knowing this, knowing where I come from, that has had a huge impact on how I perceive myself to be. Okay, because every time I see someone, say a sanitation worker, or a street sweeper, or someone working kind of a working class job, there's always a little voice in the back of my head saying, I come from that. All right, and I actually do derive a bit of inspiration from them because they came to this country searching for a better life. They started at the bottom and eventually worked their way up. You know, and I think we can use where we come from as a baseline for us to, you know, kind of make clear what we ourselves are capable of. That's another reason why this project is so interesting, because it can give clarity. You know, it can give you passion. All right, now culture and communication. Now, I've mentioned this in my classes many times. I think we, as human beings of any culture, really, human beings, we like shortcuts. Okay, we kind of like to come up with mental shortcuts for ways to make assumptions. All right, now culture is absolutely a very powerful influence, not only on the way we see ourselves, but the way we see others, and possibly the way we think others see ourselves. We communicate with others based solely on our perceptions of our background and theirs. We assume this race equates to this culture. This culture equates to this value system. This value system does not match mine, or does match mine in whatever way, but, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. And once we have a better idea, a better understanding, a better appreciation for where we come from, we can kind of apply that mindset to everyone else that we're interacting with. And understand, well, how do we really know where they come from? Maybe we're a lot more similar than we realize. I'll never forget the first time I heard about this DNA discussion project. It was the first night of orientation at Westchester University. And one of the other professors, Dr. Braz, all right, she mentioned this in passing, and if it's anything related to DNA or family history, I'm all ears. So during our break, I went right up to her and I just said, you know, this sounds like such an amazing project. I mean, it sounds like it's so cool. And she just said, do you want to volunteer? Excuse me? Are you serious? Absolutely. So I think later that week, I filled out the form, typed in everything I knew, and that's when we first met. And I had my results taken. Now, growing up, I always assumed I was white. Just simple as that. Several years ago, my father, he brought over some old photographs of his ancestors, and we determined that we actually did have some negligible Native American ancestry as well. And that is the only two components that I thought comprised who I was. Well, then I got my results. Check that out. What do I know, right? Okay, so mostly European, that makes sense to me. East Asian, now on my chart it indicated East Asian, the highest probability of that was Mongolian. And that actually makes sense because the Mongolians were one of those indigenous groups that actually migrated across the Bering Strait, the bridge of ice, some 13,000 years ago, and were actually the ancestors of the present-day Native Americans. So for all intents and purposes, that East Asian and Native American are sort of one and the same. It also indicated I was about 7% African. I spoke with my grandmother about that, and she said, I'll get right on it. and she poured over all these books, and she's on Ancestry.com, and she found out what we just discussed. Italian heritage can always be a mixture. Well, surprise. Turns out for some years the Kingdom of Italy did extend into Northern Africa, and that's probably where that came from. Now, this affected me profoundly as a person, but I think even more so as a teacher. Okay, because culture, here's the deal. It's neither purely physical, it's not purely psychological, it's a mix. It's purely a mix. All right, we are using one as a baseline to help partially define the other. Now, since I started teaching here at Delaware County, I don't think a week goes by that I don't reminisce about my experience with this. All right, every time I go into a classroom and I'm starting to teach communication and anything related to culture, there's always a voice in the back of my head saying, you know, we don't know everything. By all means, appreciate the differences, but by no means do not ignore the similarities. Because as Dr. Foman said, we are 99.9% identical. And I think if we focus on what's the same instead of what we perceive to be different, all I'm saying is just be open-minded. This project can really change your life. Definitely changed mine, and frankly, I wouldn't rather teach anywhere else as a result of this project. So thank you for your time. I will turn things over to our student participants.
name's Alyssa Massarella. I am 19 years old, and this is my last semester here. I'm going to graduate in December. So my part today is kind of just to talk about my personal experience with the project, like my family history, how I found out about the project, and the project itself. So before the project started, I was under the influence my whole life that I was 1/16 Irish, according to my mother, and we thought we were Italian. If that was it, I thought it was just white. And I believed my mom until high school, when the students would ask me about my ethnicity, and I was like, isn't it obvious? Just I'm Italian. And then I kind of thought about it, and I realized that I had some similar physical traits to the African American students and the Middle Eastern students at my school, and I kind of started to disagree with my family. I feel like there's something missing here. And my friends would always say to me, look at your hair, look at your skin, look at your lips, there's no way you're just white. So when I found out about the project in Mr. Daniels' class, I was immediately interested, and I figured because it would answer all my questions that it was something worth trying. So I went in August, and I took the test, and I was kind of under the impression that I was going to be getting my cheek swabbed, but I didn't realize that they were going to make you spit into a cup. And being the youngest person in the room, like, I was really insecure about the whole thing. Like, there's no ladylike way to spit into a cup, and everyone's looking at me, so there's really nothing I could do about it. And then so as far as my results, we were right. I'm 84% Italian, but there was a lot of other things going on in my gene pool. To my surprise, I wasn't African at all, and that means I'm potentially not Sicilian, which is what my family my whole life has thought I was. We thought we were Sicilian, but apparently it's really rare for me not to be African at all and for me to be Sicilian, so I'm not sure if that's correct. And I'm only 1% Irish. Thought it was a lot more than that. My mom was very upset about that. I'm also Hispanic. I'm Middle Eastern. I am Asian, which after looking at Ancestry.com, it's Indian. And then we also found out that we're 1% European Jewish, and my sister was really excited about that because she thought it meant we could celebrate Hanukkah this year, but I had to tell her that that's not the case. Yeah, and Christmas, so like extra presents. So I took the test because it made me realize everyone's the same racially. Like, we all have a little bit of everything in us. And the Ancestry.com statistic that I found really interesting was that it's very rare that a pie chart comes out and it's all one race. Like, it's almost impossible for you to be all one thing. Like, there's something in everyone that's like different that can surprise you. So you never really know what you are until someone makes you spit into a cup and your whole genetic makeup is laying there in front of you. So thank you.
Well, I spit in a cup also. I think it a long time ago, so I'm not worried about that. So, what's up? Okay, that's me. Okay, so I'm that one exception that I'm just about, what you see is what you get. I'm as I thought, I was delighted to be part of this. The president of Westchester joined this, so I couldn't very well say no, right? And so I was more than happy to partake in this project. Although I was pretty certain that my story, family story, was pretty much intact. And at home we have going up. Many families do this. Going up the steps. We have all the pictures of. We have literally 350 pictures. I counted them one day going up to the third floor. So I took a lot of the pictures that you see here off the wall and just brought them in. But what's interesting is what I was hoping this would do is sort of validate the story, and sure enough, that's what it did. We largely thought ourselves as being, as being mostly Irish and Scottish, and sure enough, what's behind this is that there, when I looked at more detail, mostly it concentrates in Ireland and Scotland, and mostly England and so forth. But put it all together, it's European. And so I was not particularly surprised, but so in effect this was kind of an affirming exercise for me. That little slice of African, I think, as Dr. Foreman showed earlier, we all, if you dig, go far enough back, I think we all start in Africa. I remember all you recall the discovery of the remains of Lucy in Ethiopia. I think the earliest known human, 3 million years old. So I think we all trace ourselves back eventually to Africa. So I guess it's, it'd be odd not to see a little slice of African thrown in there, but primarily European. So what I thought I'd do is just bring in. Our family doesn't, in terms of the family record and the family story, I can go back to grandparents and great-grandparents, and so that's what I thought I'd bring in today. So this gentleman here is my grandfather on my mother's side, from Bristol. So obviously that's kind of an Irish, Scottish. What's interesting about Ireland and Scotland, in the lowlands area, there's a lot of commingling, so it's very hard to, many families had to go both ways, and that's true of our family as well. So there's my grandfather on my mother's side. No surprise, the bow tie, the whole, he was a mining engineer in the Anthracite region of Pennsylvania, up in the Wilkes-Barre area. And this is obviously my mother's mother, Elizabeth McChrystal, and sitting in her lap is my mother, Lucille McChrystal. Who obviously married my father, Oscar Stiles Parker. And Parker is kind of more of an English derivation, so that's where the blending comes in. And this is on my father's side. So my father's sitting in the middle, reading a book, cute. And on his left is Jacob Parker, my great-grandfather, who served served in the Civil War. I have his discharge papers. We have a copy of his Civil War discharge papers, which is interesting. And then obviously my father, Oscar, we called him Bud, is in the middle, and Oscar Stiles Parker, his father, is on the right. Well, fortunately, you can tell we come from a fairly well-educated family. I trace my back to doctors and engineers and so forth. So very fortunate that obviously for growing up, I'm not a first-generation college graduate. I have a generational expectation that I would go to college and finish college. So I'm very fortunate to have that in my background. This is my grandmother on my father's side. So this obviously is my father's mother, Eva Anderson. And again, Anderson, we pick up the Anderson, which is really kind of a Scottish, primarily Scottish name, and comes from that. And then I threw this in because Ross Anderson is Eva's brother, and you can see he's wearing the Scottish kilt. So I thought, that even though he's in the direct line, it's sort of very affirming in terms of my background. So it's primarily European, mush it all together, but primarily Irish and Scottish in my background. So no surprise. I was hoping for some surprises, quite honestly. I was prepared to be anything, but no surprise. Came back pretty much homogenous European. So that's my background.
We have 10 minutes left for questions from the panelists. I might add, I had my DNA tested, and my family history was exclusively Russian, Ukrainian, and I came back 90% Russian, no surprise, but 10% West African. You don't get any extra credit. So I'm opening the next 10 minutes because we're done at noon. For any questions to the panelists, please take advantage of these last 10 minutes to ask questions of any of our panelists, and I'm sure they'll be glad to answer you. And before I forget, the roster should be circulating around because I need to leave with it at noon if you didn't get a chance to sign it. So are there any questions of our panelists? Yes, Brian.
Where can we go to take the DNA test?
Where can you go to take the DNA test? Who wants to answer that?
Yes, Professor Gardner here on campus actually was able to get a better price than I was on the kits, And the only thing that I would ask is if you continue to do it, we're doing research, so we ask people to fill out like a pre-survey and a post-survey, and we'd love to have anybody who participates in it, we'd love to have that data, and we can talk about projects moving
Do
forward.
they still get the Ancestry discount?
Well, that's what I'm saying. As I said, Dr. Gardner must be a great negotiator because she got a better price than I have. We've bought like hundreds and hundreds of kits, but so that might be a place to start. But we've been sharing data, so we can talk about that moving forward.
By the way, my wife entered the project and she thought she was 100% Eastern European. Turns out she's 10% Scandinavian, which was a real shock to her, as in Norway, Denmark, Finland. That was kind of interesting. Any other questions? Yeah, back there.
I have a question for the science, the actual.
For Dr. Saran.
Now, when you said the thing of all that junk in our DNA, now is that like junk from when our ancestors were like mice-like creatures to, like, say, mice-like creatures?
So the question, let me repeat it if not everyone heard it, was a lot of our DNA is, to use lack of a better word, garbage, useless. Where did that garbage come from? If it serves no use, why is it there? Just to rephrase.
Yeah, so why do we have all this non-coding DNA? Where did it come from? And kind of you asked, did we inherit it from our ancestors? We did, and really when we think about everyone in this room, we're all descended from a long line of organisms that managed to reproduce. Every organism in your ancestry managed to reproduce, because if they hadn't, you wouldn't be here. And so over time, a lot of those organisms, as they reproduced, they accumulated extra junk. So a lot of this junk is repeated sequences. So when DNA replicates, there's a chance that repeats will be copied in, will expand, so there'll be additional repeats. A lot of the junk actually seems to be descended from retroviruses. So retroviruses, things like HIV, those are viruses like HIV or herpes viruses. Those, as part of their life cycle, they integrate into their host DNA. And that's why it's hard to get rid of things like herpes and HIV. And so a lot of those sequences seem to be related to ancient retroviruses that had infected our ancestors at some point in the past, and they don't function anymore, but we can still see similarities between those sequences.
I want to mix it up so someone else with a question. Take advantage. Okay, you can have a follow-up question. You have a follow-up question?
No, so our evolutionary ancestors' DNA aren't in our DNA?
Oh, it would be, yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
so
it would be.
So can we like make a person into a mouse then?
No,
We
no,
like
because
jump around with that junk DNA in there?
well, there are other things that occur when development occurs. So you start out as a single cell, and then based on the instructions of your DNA and other things that are set up, so everyone here started out as a single fertilized egg, and that develops into a person. So then we start getting into development. But it's those differences in the DNA that cause those changes in development. The other interesting thing we see, and so the reason why we continue to maintain this junk DNA is, as organisms, we don't spend a lot of time replicating our DNA. That's not a big deal in your life. So it's like, if you've had a house for a long time and you keep throwing your extra stuff in the attic, and eventually it just accumulates up there and accumulates up there, and it's just easier to leave it up there. If you look at organisms that spend a lot of time reproducing, like bacterial cells, they don't have any of this junk DNA. And that's because if they get a little bit of junk DNA, it's a major disadvantage for them.
Next question.
Yes, someone said that DNA determines our physical traits, but that when we're born, we're a blank slate to be influenced by culture.
So let me repeat that. Someone said that DNA predestines our physical traits, but that in many other ways we're a tabula rasa, to quote John Locke, a blank slate, and that according to Tyler, culture changes who we are. So,
Well, it influences who we are.
Yeah.
So my question is, I had always thought that there was also a link between our DNA and personality traits as well as physical traits.
I'm very glad you brought that up. And actually, researchers seem to think that there are 16 basic personality types.
Myers-Briggs.
Exactly. I'm an INTJ, incidentally. And these types are actually due to like a natural hard wiring of the brain, which can actually change based on, creation. And that can influence our reaction to certain stimuli, but culture essentially tells us how we're supposed to feel about certain things, how we're supposed to live our lives. But yes, personality types, like, that's a naturally occurring little blob of primordial jelly to my understanding.
You just triggered a thought looking at my ancestry. Grandfather and great-grandfather, mathematicians like me. My wife a mathematician, and our older daughter a mathematician, and I wonder if it has something to do with genetics.
My comment would be, we don't know. There's obviously, DNA influences the structure of the brain, and we know that we can affect mood by giving people certain chemicals, so you can treat depression with drugs. And so there's a molecular basis for controlling personality, but how that interacts with culture, that's a black box right now.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just really quick, Dr. Cohen, I was wondering, in your when you ask people their pre-narrative or racial, I forget the term you used, have you found any predictor of people who their guess is wildly different than their outcome?
We actually find that people who are white, who identify with the majority, are more likely to be surprised and to resist it a little bit because they have a majority identity, which makes race tend to be less of a, quote, an issue, whereas people who identify as of color tend to be a little bit more flexible about how they see themselves before and after. But people are off, we've had multiple people of many backgrounds be bummed, like, I don't have anything else in my background. So, but it's just what they expect, and we think it's just people tend to lean into the majority of what they're around, and so that tends to be more, I'm all European. So.
Any other questions, Nick?
Where would Pacific Islander and Aboriginal DNA fit into this?
Pacific Islander and Aboriginal DNA, where do they fit in?
There is a cat, somebody could come up with a Pacific Islander. I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you calling it Asian? What are you calling it?
Yeah,
there is a category that comes up as Pacific Islander.
Okay.
So people do have that, yes.
Okay. Any other questions? We have time for one more. Take advantage, please. Yes?
How were the categories for race determined based on the DNA?
How were categories for race determined on the sequences of DNA?
Or actually, the tricky thing was, and we have used different tests over time, and each one has its benefits and its negatives, because I started out the project used to be called Science and Magic, with the narrative being the magic, because that's how you describe yourself. But I've since discovered that the science is a narrative too, because some people call certain DNA profiles North African or African. People define them differently, and so that is a challenge all the way through. And whenever we publish, there's a whole section on how we define race, how they define race. And the thing I do like about Ancestry.com is they show you a geographic circle of what they're talking about when they say North Africa or whatever it might be. But we have to clump it. If somebody will say to us, for example, they're Irish, we call Irish, Italian, all that. We will call that European. And so you're always trying to nudge that, and if somebody says they're Indian, for example, we had a whole discussion about how we're going to categorize that. So it's quite a process. But that's a great question.
Yeah. Also, when my wife entered the project, she got a list of people who matched up highly with her, some of whom have her maiden name, but she's unaware of being a relative. So you can actually contact these high matches. You get that as well, at least my wife did in the project, which is fascinating.
My daughter got a list of names back, and she doesn't have my last name, she's my husband's last name, and it said, you may be related to these people.
Yeah, and what freaked out my wife is they had her maiden name,
Yeah,
and she registered with my last name.
Yes, shocking.
So she's really interested in contacting these people. Tell your friends this is going to be repeated at 5 o'clock. Thank you for all coming.